in a single system where they have the same environmental pressures. And we know that the early life environment, whether you're stock or you're raising a hatchery or you're raising a natural system, that varies a lot, and that can have a lot of impacts on your behaviors throughout your life. So oftentimes, organisms learn behaviors that are specific to their environment, the optimal conditions for their local stimuli, and fish hatcheries can cause this inadvertent domestication. So you can think about how there's all these different pressures that are in a hatchery system, specific to a hatchery system, that might not be the best for a local or a natural condition, and this might lead to behaviors that are irreversible. They have lifelong impacts, and a great example of this is needle habitat imprinting. If you're imprinting on something that's resembling a hatchery when you're a young juvenile, that's what you're going to be looking for later on in life as an adult. And in Lake Champlain, we see differences in the juvenile behaviors between the stocked and wild lake trout. We've seen differences in their foraging behaviors. We've seen differences in things like their metabolic demand, where the stockfish are depleting their lipids a lot more quickly than the wild fish. And then also differences in their habitat use. There's a lot more wild fish showing up in the central part of the lake compared to the north and south. And also the stockfish seem to be going a little bit deeper. And so this last part, the thing that I'm really going to be focusing on today, is this habitat use, but rather looking at it from the adult's perspective, and again, focusing in during that spawning period. So we've got this prediction that the stocked and wild adult lake trout in Lake Champlain are going to have different spawning behaviors based on 3 different things. The first thing is the distribution throughout the lake. So like we saw with the juveniles, thinking that the stockfish are going to be present more in the south and more north in the south compared to the wild fish. Also thinking about the vertical distribution, so again with the juveniles, the stockfish are deeper, so maybe that means that the stocked adults are spawning on deeper habitats compared to some of these wild fish. And then lastly, I've been thinking of it as like movement intensity, where the stocked individuals are moving less than some of these wild fish. And the way that we addressed this was using acoustic telemetry, where we implanted a bunch of lake trout in the lake with these transmitters that send out signals about once every 1 to 2 minutes for up to 3 years. We placed the receivers throughout the lake, and we placed them. We have about 50 receivers. I'll show them where those locations are, but they detect the fish when they come within a range, so then we have an exact time that we know that fish was at that receiver. And then we also included a subset of transmitters that had pressure sensors so we could know what depth of fish we're using. We tagged a total of 38 stocked and 15 wild adult lake trout. And of those, 16 stocked fish had pressure sensors and 10 wild fish had pressure sensors. Here's a map of the distribution where the receivers were placed. And we were really targeting different locations, focusing on things like those transition points, the openings in the causeways where fish would have to pass through to use these different basins, things like the underwater lake mounts, where there might be some really optimal habitat, and then also previously known spawning sites. So we have all this movement going on, and we can visualize this. This is a subset of the population that was tagged. These are just wild adults, and we can see where they're moving throughout the lake. This is really just focusing in the central part of the lake, and we get an idea of the shifts in the depth and regional distribution of the fish, but also how you pay attention to the timing on the bottom. The spawning period for lake trout begins in about November, so watch what happens when this hits November. All of a sudden, these fish are moving around a lot more. So we can see that there's differences in the rate of movement that these fish are using. So the first thing that I really want to look at is just where are these fish spawning? And this figure is showing the distribution of stocked fish during the spawning season, where each circle represents a receiver location. The size of the circle is the percentage of stocked fish that showed up at that location, and then the intensity of the color represents the amount of time that the fish were there based on the average number of detections. So we can see that in the central part of the lake, there's a lot of fish showing up, but they're also really using the northern and southern parts of the lake. In contrast, the wild fish aren't really using that north and south part of the lake, but are still occurring in the central region. And what's really interesting about this north part of the lake is that there's an eggweed fish hatchery right off the shoreline of where one of those receivers are, and effluent water from that hatchery flows right into the lake. And that's also where there's a jetty, and that video that I showed at the start is where those lake trout were recorded. Another fascinating thing about this site is that it has one of the highest egg deposition rates ever recorded for lake, or the densest egg deposition rates ever recorded for lake trout. So they really like to use this spot. but it's really just stocked fish that are going there. The wild fish, for whatever reason, aren't going to that spot to spawn. Instead, both stocked and wild fish are really using that central area. Another way of thinking about this is habitat selectivity. So how much are fish using an area relative to the amount of space that's available to them? And again, starting with the stocked fish, you can see that they're kind of selecting the central and southern part of the lake. They're using the northern part as much as it's available, but again, that's all really focused on that one location right outside of that hatchery. If we compare that to the wild fish, you can see that they're also using the central and southern parts of the lake, but they're actually avoiding that northern part of the lake where a lot of the stockfish are going. So we know that there's differences in the horizontal distribution of where these fish are going based on their origin. Are there differences based on depth? So in this plot, we're looking at the daily average depth for an individual during the spawning season for the north, central, and southern parts of the lake. As I mentioned, they vary in the maximum depth that's available. So that's what the horizontal dotted line represents, the maximum depth for that area. And in general, we see that most of the fish are actually having similar depth distributions. They're mostly spawning in shallow habitats, which is kind of what we were expecting. A little bit unfortunate, we were hoping they were using some of those deep offshore seamounts or lake mounts, but this isn't surprising for us. You'll notice there are some regional differences, but that's also likely driven by just the habitat that's available to these fish. The southern part of the lake, they're able to go deeper. Some of them will go a little bit deeper, but they're not spending a lot of time down there, but that's going to adjust the average. So then the last thing that we're really looking at was this movement intensity. So I want to start by just looking at how much of these fish are moving based on where they're getting detected. And so again, we have 3 different locations or regions of the lake. We've got stocked in purple, wild, and green. And just looking at the average distance that these fish are moving in kilometers. And this is distance between positions that are based on centers of activity. And so I've got a quick video just to kind of explain what the center of activity is and how we're calculating that distance. So if you look at the red point, here's our fish. It's showing up these 3 different receivers, and this is all within an hour period. And so then we calculate, or we figure out what's the average position of that fish. Well, it turns out it's about right where that X is. So then in the next hour, where's this fish going? Comes down, hits these 2 receivers, goes back up, and this is also a weighted average. So now we're saying that this position is a little bit closer to that northern receiver, and then we can calculate the distance between those 2 X's, and it's like an average distance of how much this fish is moving. And what we're seeing is that the wild fish are really moving a lot more than these stocked fish. And that's consistent across regions, but really just or most for the north and central parts of the lake. And this might be somewhat driven by the number of receivers that are in the different regions. If you have more receivers, you're more likely to get detected. So that means that it's a greater chance that you're going to show up as another movement event. And one thing that's hard to see from this figure, though, is that there's a lot of zeros down here, which means that there's a lot of fish that aren't really moving around, and it's hard to distinguish these zeros. But what we are seeing is that the stockfish are moving less often, and another way of looking at that is how much time are these fish staying in a single position. So that's what this figure is showing here, is the average amount of detections, you can think that as time, that fish are staying in these positions. And again, I'm using this based on the centers of activity, and I'm averaging positions that are close together to a 1 kilometer space. So if you move a few meters to your right or left, it's not going to be a new position, you're still in the same general area. If you move a kilometer away, that you're going somewhere new. And so just another way of looking at that, we have our fish that comes down, spends a lot of time, that north receiver comes down, spends a little time with the southern one. We have our position. If you imagine the next hour does something kind of similar, you move that position a little bit further south, but they're still in that same 1 kilometer range, so we would average all these, or we would count all these detections together for that single position, and what we see is the stockfish are spending a lot more time in these individual positions. So taking this into account with the amount of movement, we're seeing that, yeah, the wild fish are moving around, on average, a lot more than the stocked individuals. So what's all this mean? Are there differences between stocked and wild fish as adults? Yes, there are. They have different spawning site selections. So we see that the wild fish are really just focusing on that central part of the lake. There's also stocked fish going there, but obviously all wild fish have to come from some stocked fish. So there's suggestions that there's optimal habitat that's located in that central part of the lake. Where exactly it is, we don't know yet. We're hoping to find that out. And once we do, maybe we can figure out if there's other habitats in the lake that have similar characteristics. Also, all the stockfish seem to be going back, only stockfish seem to be going back to that northern site, and that one right up by the hatchery. There's not really great evidence of lake trout having natal homing or imprinting, but this somewhat suggests that they may. If you have all these stockfish and only stockfish coming back to this site that's right outside of this hatchery, is that because they're coming back to an area that resembles what they would consider their home? We also did not see any differences between the vertical habitat or the depth use by the stock and wild fish. So while we were hoping to see the fish using those lake mouths, it suggests that that's not the case. So we might want to look at, or really focus on nearshore habitats, shallow nearshore habitats. And then lastly, the individual stock adults are moving less than these wild fish. And this really raises the question of if these wild fish are using more sites than the stock ones. And it's hard to say with these data because we don't have great coverage, receiver coverage of the lake, so we don't know exactly where all these fish are going. There might be sites that we're missing, but in general, we're getting some great differences in the behaviors, both in the distribution and the amount of time that these fish are spending at these locations based on their origin. And this has some really important implications. So as I mentioned at the start, it took about 40 years of stocking for natural recruitment to finally occur in Lake Champlain, at least at detectable amounts. And so, is there something going on where these stocked fish have poor spawning site selection that's limiting the natural recruitment? We know that the stockfish are going to that Gordon Landing site, that site in the north. We know that they're spawning there. We've even captured fry at that site. But for whatever reason, those fry seem to not be surviving. And are the sedentary behaviors of these stocked fish limiting their probability of moving around to a bunch of different sites and potentially depositing eggs on a spot where their offspring will survive? Also thinking about different hatchery practices that might promote some of these natural behaviors. This is often done for improving other behaviors, things like the feeding of a lot of these fish, and some ways that we might be able to do this, things like adding currents to some systems. Maybe some natural structures that if you take something from the lake, is it more likely for fish to return to that spot as an adult? And then lastly, just thinking about how do artificial structures really influence these stock populations. We have tons of artificial structures throughout Lake Champlain, and just in general that people have added to the number of water bodies. And while they might look attractive to us and even to the fish, we don't know how the long-term impacts of those sites might be. We don't know how, after those eggs hatch, is that still going to be good nursery habitat? Is it still going to have everything that those offspring need to survive past that gauntlet of all the challenges they have to face before they recruit back into the population? So the picture on the bottom here is it's a break wall outside of Burlington Bay in the central part of Lake Champlain. And it's possible that this structure is supporting all of the recruitment, or a lot of the recruitment, in the lake. What makes this structure different from the one at the northern spot where there doesn't really seem to be any recruitment coming off of that site? We don't know yet, but there's a great need for us to start looking at these structures with a lot more detail and trying to figure out what makes it such a great spot, not so much just for spawning on that site, but also for the nursery habitat, and whatever else it might be that these fish really need in order to survive, not just past hatching, but to get past the point where they can start to survive and recruit to the population. There's a lot of folks that need to be thanked for this project. I've got great people on my dissertation committee, in addition to the co-authors on the paper or the project. Tons of undergraduate assistants and graduate assistants through the Houston Ecosystem Science Lab, and we also had a lot of funding provided for this project through the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, and then also $50,000 made available through the Real-Time Aquatic Ecosystems Observation Network, or RAYON, up in Canada. And I also want to thank all of you for being here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.